Okay, Jason, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to you here for coming. Let me just, okay. How do I make that bigger? Sorry. Okay. Today I want to emphasize history and geography. And let me just emphasize, if you can't see the screen, it might not, if you can't read that, you're going to miss a lot of the lecture. If you can't see, where's the green line? Excuse me a second. Well, there it is. If you can't see these green lines, again, you might not follow me. You're all young, you seem to have good eyesight, so I assume you're okay. For me, if I moved any further away from this, it would be out of it. So, 9/11 was 20 years ago. Some of you may not have been born then, but that was something out of the blue for American policy makers. Who are these people, and why did they just kill 3,000 Americans? And that's receded in the interest of foreign policy, people in favor of matters such as China, and I think that's correct. China in the longer term is probably a bigger concern. But particularly with the retreat in Afghanistan and the takeover there, we're going to see a conflict centered around radical Islam increasing in the next couple of years. And I want to try and help us to understand why that is the case. And I find with many Americans don't know very much about the history of dealing with the relations of the Christian world and the Muslim world. There's an expression we use, Christendom, as distinct from Christianity per se, that you have countries, continents, which have been influenced by Christianity, such as Europe. But everything a European power does or has done is not necessarily Christian. So you have a world sort of influenced by Christianity with many things going on. And so we have the expression Christendom. I hate bringing up new words, but I would recommend starting to use the term Islamdom for the same reason, that we shouldn't quickly move from something that a Muslim majority country is doing or Muslims are doing to assume there's something specifically Islamic about it. We're dealing with these two worlds. But those worlds have been influenced by different religions, and it sets up different patterns and has a history of conflict. I'm going to emphasize the conflict over the last 1,400 years, but again, we need a caution here that Christians and Muslims in the world have been doing other things in the last 1,400 years other than fighting. Trading with each other, going back and forth, meeting, learning, criticizing each other. Some of Thomas Aquinas' writings are specifically addressed to Muslim philosophers and debating. So I'm focusing on the conflict side because that's come to the fore again. But remember, there are many other things going on. So those are some background comments. I don't know if any of you have ever read a delightful short book called The Devil's Dictionary, which was written by a satirical writer, Ambrose Bierce, almost 100 years ago. And it will give you a word and give you often a highly sarcastic definition of it, and many of them are extremely funny. If you go in the Devil's Dictionary and look up the term war, after it says, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. a quip often too accurate to be entirely funny. Probably one could also say that war is God's way of teaching Americans history as well. But often we're not. Of all sort of major societies in the world, the US is often the most ahistorical one. An American might say of something, oh, that's history, meaning it's not important. That's just history. It's gone. It's behind. Almost everybody else in the world would say, that's history, which means it's a fundamental shaping factor for where we are now, and we won't understand where we are unless we do that. So I want to look at this history from the origins of Islam, which will take us 632, which it is in Islamic traditions, till now. So I'm going to cover a major portion of the history of the world over the last 1400 years in the space of 20 minutes, which means that I will generalize, I will lack nuance and proper qualifications, miss certain things out. But I very much want to try and give an overall big picture. And the thing to remember about the Muslim majority world is there's very much a historical consciousness there. So in the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein, the then leader of Iraq, or second Gulf War, kept referring to George W. Bush as Halugo. That would be meaningless to most Americans. It would mean a lot to most Iraqis and others. This was the leader of the Mongols when they sacked Baghdad and destroyed it within 48 hours and probably killed several 100,000 people. The sort of marauding savages. So this is his image of George W. Bush. Later Osama bin Laden would refer to Al-Andalus, Andalusia, southern Spain, a term often not known to American. The late leader of ISIS, the Islamic State, al-Baghdadi, would refer to places like Sham and Khorasan. Would we know where they are? To a little bit now, if you followed news in Afghanistan, the ISIS group there is usually listed as ISIS-K. Yes, what does the K stand for? This is Khorasan, which is their word for a lot of Central Asia. So they're making historical references which would be understood by their audiences. There would be a resonance of saying, oh, that's what they're talking about. This is the way things are. And we miss much of that. So, but to begin with the life of Islam's prophet, Muhammad. Muhammad was successful as a religious teacher. Obviously, there are 1.6 billion people in the world who are in one form or another Muslim. So Muhammad was successful in that. He was also successful as a political leader and a military leader. If you look at the deep purple section here in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, that was probably the area being ruled by Muhammad at the time of his death. It's very hard to get separate historical references from this other than those from within Islam, but certainly you had that area. A pretty big chunk of country. So, and he also, so that's what was ruled at the time of his death. He also promised his followers similar success. There is, Islam also teaches about patience and long suffering, but I think it would be fair to say it's a less developed theme there than it is in Christianity. The fact that the truth would win in this world is a very strong thing. So Muslims expected success because theirs was the final revelation, the true revelation, and it should succeed in the world. And succeed it did. So this is the map of the Middle and Near East, going up to about the year 750. So at the time of Muhammad's death, they control this area. If you go to 661, and here we're talking about 29 years later, controlled this area, the middle purple. Okay, right from the Atlantic Ocean over to the Arabian Sea, and much in between, moving into Europe and into Central Asia. If you move ahead to the year 750, then you have the light purple, expansion into Asia. What this map misses out, by 732, exactly 100 years after Muhammad's death, this boundary was not here, but Islamic armies were moving through France and were finally stopped by Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers in 732. So most Americans, again, many Westerners, in talking about the relations, conflict between Christianity and Islam, suddenly assumed there was this thing called the Crusades, which came from nowhere. And you tell them, well, Muslim Arab armies were marching on Paris, or they burnt the churches in Rome, or had war bands going through Switzerland. People are often not aware of this early expansion. So here we have, Spain, Portugal, southern France at one end, and moving over here, this is the Indus River, from where we get the name India. So they're controlling, northern India through to Spain, and then off into Central Asia. So an amazing expansion in 1 century. They've taken over, what we now call Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, the Arabian Peninsula, moving south here towards Sudan. They've got Persia, Armenia, portions of Central Asia and India. In fact, that western boundary, that boundary you see here is Western China. So they're occupying territory from China to the Atlantic Ocean in 1 century. A few comments we've made here is nearly all the territories they took over were Christian majority territories. There was one Jewish kingdom at the time, which was in Arabia, but you're talking about the takeover of the heartland of Christianity. Europe was not the heartland of Christianity. It was here. So, amazing expansion, amazing conquest, the takeover of much of the Christian world. And one should add, we don't like imperialism generally, and we don't like marauding armies taking people over. But it needs to be said that this was not unusual. It wasn't as if the Byzantine, Byzantine Empire here, or the Persian Safavids here, if they could have done that, they would. I mainly want to emphasize not so much the imperial aspect of it as the successful aspect of it. These were empire builders, and that's what empires do. As much as you can, you seek to expand and control the territories around you. So here's this amazing expansion. And if you're a Muslim looking at this, you think, well, obviously this is the true religion. We're here from China to the Atlantic in 100 years. Let's move on a bit further. This is the 1100. And I've never been able to find a series of maps which match, so I have to mix and match. But here now, that green line, I hope you can see, is the boundary of Muslim control. A slight pushback in Spain with the Reconquista, but in Africa now expanding south across the Sahara, taking over West Africa, then right down the East African coast to Mozambique and others, further expansion into India, across northern India, and more expansion into China, into Central Asia, and what we now call Turkey. Let's leap ahead to the year 1500. Here's the boundary line, defeated in Spain. The last stronghold in Granada was 1492. As an aside, that's why Columbus ended up over here, because when he went to apply to a grant from Ferdinand and Isabella for the expedition across the Atlantic. And where were Ferdinand and Isabella when Columbus reached them? They were in Granada, having just defeated the last Moorish, that is the Moors from Morocco, Islamic kingdom. So they were in a very good mood. This was the right time for his fundraising effort. So they gave him the money and he sailed across the Atlantic. So here, oops. So now further expansion down the West African coast, for the Atlantic coast, across the Sahara, now getting into the Black African Heartlands. Expansion here, then the takeover of most of India, and then by this point, most of the expansion is fairly peaceful. So takeover in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim majority country, largely peacefully. Also, this map doesn't show it, but then the southern Philippines. Moving into Central Asia here, places now like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Moving now into European Russia, takeover of the Ukraine, and then the movement in Europe of coming through here, takeover of what is now Greece, then Bulgaria, Romania, Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, Hungary, and into Austria. So the first siege of Vienna was, I think, 1525. Second one was 1683. A point to make here, again, we often forget, is over half the land area of Europe has at some point been under the control of Muslims for periods of over a century. Again, that's not a thing we are aware of, but a lot of people in the Balkans, if you wondering why a place like Hungary gets very worried about the massive influxes of Muslim refugees. It's because they were ruled by the Turks for several centuries. So that's in the historical memory. And again, Vienna, in the heart of Europe, was again being attacked by Ottoman Turks. So so you have the year 1500, about 900,000 years after Muhammad's death, you have this pattern of worldwide control. It reaches out further. You had slave raids going up the coast here in Britain and reaching as far as Iceland. So as a side anecdote, I might remember that one of Dick Cheney's forebears was, I was listening to a speech in Washington, D.C., and the guest of honor was the very distinguished historian of Islam, Bernard Lewis, and the sort of guest of honor was Dick Cheney, then vice president. And Bernard Lewis, who seems to know everything, was commenting on this and discussing slave raiding, and particularly slave raids on Ireland, and mentions that in 1625 there were slave raids from Moors out of Morocco, south of Dublin, and amongst those taken prisoner and enslaved was one Dick Cheney. So how Lewis knew that, I don't know, but it was very nice to know that, for the vice president to know that one of his namesakes at least had been enslaved. So, but here you have this sort of massive expansion and massive control. Islam had triumphed. It's ruling from the areas up here from the Baltic Sea down to the Southern Oceans, from the Atlantic over to the Pacific. These were, of course, different countries. It was not one state. But these were areas ruled by Muslims and thought of as part of the Muslim world. And not only the military side. At least in its earlier history, it was much more cultured than the West. Its science was often more advanced. Its philosophy and literature were well developed. It was wealthy. It had many skills. And so that's why sort of the Europeans and the people in the Middle East were doing lots of trade with each other. But this is the dominant world civilization. The sort of Hindu world of India is largely under Muslim control. Not much effect in China, but China's staying here within its own borders. Europe is weak and divided and cold and wet, so wasn't really a rival, and there isn't a rival out of Africa. So this is the dominant world civilization. 1,000 years. So you have 1,000 years of stunning success. For Muslims, at least for many Muslims, this confirmed the rightness of their belief. Sacred history and secular history combined as one. The true religion showed its place by quickly becoming the dominant religion and the dominant civilization in the world. The truth had won. And then things began to change. Of course, nothing in history changes instantly. It was that Muslims, and if we take the Ottoman Turks as an example, you started to lose more battles than you used to. And then you find yourself losing more battles than you win. And then you find yourself slowly retreating and pulling back. And again, this happens slowly. If I wanted to take one symbolic date as symbolizing the turning point, it would be September the 11th, 1683. This is the second Ottoman siege of Vienna in Austria. And the Ottomans had been there before, but hadn't really been defeated, just withdrew. Winter was coming on, it wasn't a good time to fight, so they withdrew. But in 1683, they were defeated very badly by combined European armies, principally the Poles, and were pushed back. They fled, they left their encampment behind, and that was taken over by the sort of Christian, European alliance, and the Ottomans kept going back. By the way, the story is told that one of the things the Europeans found when they took over the Ottoman encampment outside of Vienna was this brown stuff, which they weren't sure what it was before. It was coffee. And the story, it's hard to verify, but the story is that that was the entrance of coffee to the Western world. One of the benefits of the defeat in Vienna. But anyway, this meant that the Muslim world began to, I'll move to this one, started to get pushed back in Europe. This area here, Vienna's right there, starting to get a push back there, but let me take a further step back in history. Basically, you have the Islamic expansion for roughly 1,000 years, and then that's turned aside in three different waves. As Europe, seen by the Europeans as Christian and seen by the Muslims largely as Christian, at this point began to take over portions of the Muslim world. I mentioned Columbus before. Why did he want to go across the Atlantic? Well, he wanted to trade with China, which he thought if he went that way, he'd get there, which you would, but of course he wasn't aware that there were a couple of continents in the way. But he wanted to sail around the Muslim world. You could trade across here, the Silk Road was there, and people were doing it, but it's very expensive. You know, you're carting stuff, 6,000 miles over land where every petty ruler wants their tax and their credit and their customs duties. It was expensive. So if you could sail there directly. Then the Portuguese, also wanting to trade with the East, finally got around Africa and went up here, established bases around here in Angola, what's now Angola, Mozambique, Yemen, Goa off the coast of India, and then moving into the East Indies over here. So again, the Portuguese are sort of after trade, later on conquest, but to try and get around the Muslim world. That's what's happening when people go down here. And that started to move from merely trading in bases into conquest. This happens slowly. But you got the Portuguese started taking over portions of India and large portions over here. In fact, the Portuguese in 1506 out of Aden started an expedition to seek to conquer Mecca. Alfonso de Albuquerque does this. So later on, the British start to take over India, most of which was ruled by, at this point, by Muslims. It's majority Hindu, but Muslim rulers. They also take over Malaysia. Now the Dutch come in and take over, what is now Indonesia. Later on, the French move south and start taking over Morocco, Algeria, and these other places. So we have the phenomena which is often now called colonialism. That is European powers taking over large chunks of the globe, particularly the outlying areas of the Muslim world. I think colonialism is a misleading term because it implies that this is a new phenomenon in the world, that Europeans somehow invented this thing where they went off and conquered other countries. I think we should just use the old term imperialism because countries and empires have been doing this forever. What was different about the Europeans is they did it by sea. Usually imperial power, you conquer the people next door. But once that's settled, then you go for the people on the other side of them. So that's generally how the Romans operated. It was how the Arab empires did, the Ottoman empires and others, the Russian Empire. You go by land, your armies go and conquer your neighbor. The Europeans did something different. They started sailing and conquering places a long way away. That was the difference. It was, I would call it maritime imperialism. But I want to emphasize the continuity of imperialism. In that sense, colonialism was not a new phenomenon. It continues an age-old pattern. And they're in fact overtaking other empires. So it's maritime imperialism, often called colonialism, that's one feature. The other is the places the Europeans are taking over are Muslim-ruled places. We're taking over large chunks of the Muslim majority world or the Muslim ruled world here. And this is a new phenomenon for Muslims. So widespread defeat and being driven back from areas Muslims had controlled for centuries. How on earth was this happening? So this is the first phase, the takeover of outlying Muslim areas, that is not the Middle East, but large chunks of Africa, East and West Coast, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia are being taken over. So that's one phase. A second one is being driven out of Europe. This map has disappeared. Okay. Let's use this one. This is like that other map which had the red circle, had the green line. This is the sort of expansion of Islam, the areas controlled by Muslims, roughly 1600. So you had the colonial takeover, which we described taking these areas, and then they're pushed out of Spain in the Reconquista, and then defeat in Austria, followed by defeat in Hungary, in Serbia, what is now Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, the Greek War of Independence, and then the Russian expansion, going down through here, through what is now the Ukraine, the spiritual heartland of the Rus, and going into places whose names we might recognize now, places like Chechnya, taking that over. Then Russian expansion into the Muslim majority Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. So you're getting this European pushback coming here. So that's an ongoing phase here. So the Europeans, whose self-image would still be largely Christian, and whose image in the minds of many Muslims would be, these are Christians doing it. The Christians are attacking and taking over our land. So that's the second phase. If we move to the third phase, here we need a different style of map. This is the Middle East, about 1925. We haven't got all of it here. The third phase would be the takeover of the Muslim heartlands in the Middle East by Europeans or infidels or Christians. You may remember in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire isn't shown here. Its heartland was Turkey. Its headquarters was in Istanbul here. But the Ottomans controlled, chunks of Egypt, the Middle East, Levant over here, and a lot of the Mediterranean coast of North Africa as empire. They allied with the Axis powers, with Germany, Austria-Hungary, in the First World War, and came out on the losing side. And so their territories were carved up. And at this point in the heartland, you've got just off the map in Algeria and there Morocco, these are being run by France. Egypt is nominally independent. It's got independence from the Ottoman, but in practice is being run by the British, who sort of maintained control, a large measure of control, to the middle of the 20th century, usually by promising to leave every 5 years. So they're controlling that. And then these provinces here, we now call Syria, Iraq, the Palestinian areas, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, were handed over to Britain and France as protectorates, saying they're now free from rule by the Ottoman Turks, but not ready for self-government. So, France is looking after Lebanon and Syria, the Brits, the Palestinian, Israeli areas, Jordan, and Iraq. So you have this takeover. And there's another feature here. That Turkey now is nominally independent. It's overwhelmingly Muslim majority. But its new ruler after the First World War is Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, the highly successful general in Turkish Ottoman general in the First World War. And he was very secular, perhaps an atheist, but he wanted to disrupt Islamic influence. So he shifted the Turkish script, the way you wrote things, away from Arabic script to a Western Latin script. Made other moves, diminished the function and independence of the mullahs, forbade the wearing of the fez, a traditional Islamic garment, and in many ways, tries to radically secularize the country. In 1924, he abolishes the Caliphate. This was the nominal ruler of all the Muslims. As I say, these were all different countries. Egypt and India and Pakistan were not one country. They had their own rulers. But there was this idea that the Muslim world has a unity. There's a word for the people, the Ummah, the Muslim world, the Muslim people should have a unity. And the dream was we should be united into one Islamic state and ruled by a caliph. That's why ISIS always talks about restoring the caliphate. And Al-Qaeda has done that. Well, there was a nominal caliph out of Turkey, didn't have much power. But in principle, the idea that was there that there is a sort of nominal ruler of the Muslims. Anyway, Ataturk in Turkey just abolishes it. And the caliph is kicked out, has to fly out of the country. So this dream of Islamic unity is being destroyed in one of the few countries in the world which is actually not being controlled by Christians. And you'll find in this period, if you look at Osama bin Laden's speeches in terms of some major turning points and things in the world, it's the 1920s which he emphasizes very strongly. The things we often focus on, Israel, Palestine, other questions, yeah, they're important to him. But it's the 1920s when infidels take over the heartland of the Muslim world and the Caliphate is turned over. His first major videotape after the attacks on the US on September the 11th, 2001, he says, following World War I, which ended more than 83 years ago, the whole Islamic world fell under the Crusader banner, under the British, French, and Italian governments. They divided the whole world. That's a fairly accurate description. And even the places they hadn't grabbed, Turkey I've mentioned, it's a highly secular country or ruler at this time. Persia, Iran is somewhat different. So these are very secular, not very Islamic countries. Where else does that leave us? Well, there's sort of Afghanistan as sort of still ruled by Muslims, but that's way out in the back of beyond. So it only left the only substantial area of the Muslim majority world being ruled actually by Muslims was here, the major part of the Arabian Peninsula, encompassing what is now Saudi Arabia and portions of Yemen. The rest of the Muslim world is being controlled by Christians. So, and then things get even worse. That this area, Saudi Arabia, or at this point just Arabia, is taken over by the Saudi families. So with due modesty, they renamed the country Saudi Arabia. It's the only country, I think, named after a family. And but at least the only significant Muslim majority territory not to fall under the infidel. It's where Muhammad taught, fought, ruled, and died, the destination of the Hajj, home of the two holy sites. The infidel had not gone there, except the First Gulf War. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and to be pushed out, you need to attack from Saudi territory, just to the south. So if the Saudis wanted help from other powers, there'd have to be troops on that shore. So foreign troops did indeed come in, and so, you had American soldiers, hello, we're from America, we're here to help. But they're setting foot on the Holy Land. Again, let me quote Osama bin Laden, same video. Says, the land has now fallen to the infidel. This is the latest and greatest aggression. Now infidels walk on the land where Muhammad was born and where the Quran was revealed. That was his greatest grievance. The infidels were allowed in the land where no infidel should tread. And against this background, if you watch the sort of Muslim world cave in from controlling this to, controlling this, you're watching the wall slowly coming in. Indonesia's taken over, India's taken over, West Africa is taken over, North Africa is taken over, Syria's taken over, Iraq is taken over. You see this coming in, and then you see American troops appearing in Saudi Arabia, the only place for 1,400 years you really hadn't had non-Muslim troops. You don't have to be totally paranoid to see a pattern and say, yeah, they're here to help. Will they ever leave? So for Islamic radicals, they see all of this as a particular pattern, the aggression by the Western Christian world against Islam. And there is truth in that. But what is the overall picture here? You have had 1,000 years of stunning success. Culturally, civilizationally, militarily, sort of defeating the infidels, the truth wins, followed by 300 years of crushing failure. At most World League tables, you're sitting near the bottom. And the question here is, why? What happened? Well, to quote the title of a book by Bernard Lewis, I recommend very strongly, What Went Wrong? Originally based on an article in the Atlantic magazine. And that's still a major discussion in the Muslim world. How come we were the sort of dominant civilization in 1200? And there was a lot of openness, a lot of scientific work. We had astronomers. We invented algebra. Algebra is an Arab word, the al-Jibra. So is Gibraltar, in places like that. Why? And there are many answers, and people still struggle with that. But if we divide it into two, one answer is we fell behind because we refused to learn and adapt. The Europeans and others developed more advanced technology, different ways about thinking about politics, views of individual freedom, of democracies, of scientific and technological development, and things of this kind, which we sealed ourselves off on. So we became rigid, frozen, and did not develop. We went back to sort of old superstitious ways. And so we collapsed in the world. That's one set of answers. That's still influential. The other set of answers is we stopped being good Muslims. That when we were true to Islam, when we were willing to fight for it, when we took our guidance from the Quran and the Hadith and didn't pick up foreign ways, then we were successful for 1,000 years. It says, it's when we began to try and copy the infidel that things fell apart. And we need to get away from that. So we need to restore a pristine form of Islam and have Islam as it was in the first centuries, or even in the first century. And a lot of the people who do that we call Salafi. Salafi is the companions, those who the rightly guided people who were there with Muhammad. This is also the picture you will get if you look at Al-Qaeda materials or ISIS materials. Amongst the terrorist groups, it's very much, we were bad Muslims, so they want to recreate what they believe is the original form of Islam. And of course, with ISIS, to reestablish the Caliphate. And that's what drives a lot of the radical groups. Even people who are not radical still think, we stopped being good Muslims and we need to give Islam a larger place in our society, culture, and politics, and not try and take over too much from the West. You could believe that without being a sort of radical or a terrorist or anything. But it's certainly the mind in a lot of the terrorist groups. So that struggle and debate and all sorts of positions in between is a major thing, major discussion going on in the Muslim world. And beyond that, discussions in the West of how the Islamic world or Muslim majority world is going revolve around these poles. But to summarize the overall picture, what we had was 1,000 years of aggression by Muslims against the, quote, Christian West or Christendom. And successfully, followed by 300 years of aggression of the Christian world against the Muslim majority world. So you've had this pattern of conflict. Is this resurrecting now with the sort of major defeat of a lot of the Muslim world after the First World War, or at least its control of it passing to European Christian powers? Will we see a resurgence of this conflict? Obviously, at some level, we do. ISIS and other groups are doing that. But will there be larger scale antagonism between Christendom and Islamdom? Obviously, I don't know. But I hope we can avoid that. In order to avoid it, it's important that we know something of this history, what has been going on, and important enough to know why it is that Muslims don't have to be radicals. Muslims often feel a sense of grievance against the West and see us as colonial powers, because in the last 300 years we did actually take over most of the Muslim majority world. So we need to be aware of those grievances in our discussions in history if we are to avoid either repeating or simply continuing the patterns we see here. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, went on a bit too long, but anyway.
I know that we have some food that people can probably smell, but I do want to have a portion of time to in just a few minutes, and then we'll continue conversation over the dinner. One, Mark, if you have anything you want to say, or no, are we good? You want to give it?
Thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for always listening to insiders and Washington. And also, our hope is that these conversations that we're listening to effectively will lead to ongoing movement related to the topic of what we call political theology. So if you're interested in forming that kind of leadership desire, please let us know. We'd love to support you and encourage you.
We'll have a hand with this in a second. We want a few questions now, just so you can start thinking as we get ready for the food. And then please continue the conversation at your table. We'll try to disperse all the speakers and guests around the table. So if anybody want to jump in right away?
I just want to know, why do you think this kind of stuff is taught or isn't taught in Western schools? Like, why is this stuff just totally just wiped from our history?
Hold on a second. I can't quite hear you. I know you've got a mask on, it's difficult, but...
Why do you think this isn't taught in our schools today? Why do you think it's really wipe out what happened in this part of the world?
Often not much history is taught, sort of in general. Here there would be probably now No, yeah, I mean, it wasn't taught 50 years ago. It's not just a sort of woke or politically correct thing. But that's an overlay here. You don't want to sort of talk about Islamic imperialism, even if you're going to talk about Christian imperialism as well. So people sort of want to cut this off. The world either begins with colonialism in the 1490s or earlier with the Portuguese, or this thing happened which we call the Crusades, as if this was some new phenomenon. You might notice I didn't mention the Crusades, they're passing early on. People ask why. I said, well, it wasn't important. So it wasn't particularly important to the Arab world because they won. To quote Bernard Lewis again, it was a short-lived failed attempt to recapture some Christian lands, which were probably Christian majority then. So it wasn't, that traumatic. It was part of the ongoing conflict. Not a new phenomenon. It just meant that some Western Europeans, the Franks, had decided to join in the fight. What affected the Muslim world was the Mongol conquest. They killed probably more people over the weekend than the Crusaders had done in 2 centuries. So I think there's that element. And beyond that, I think it's a sort of just a general lack of attention to history, why people don't know. I find this, and I said, I mentioned to people, I said, well, when the Arab armies were marching on Paris, they look at you as if, don't you know that? And lots of other things like this. So anyway, I'm just going on. I think there's some political correctness now, but it's sort of inattention to history. And I think another feature is world history. We often haven't done that. You might talk about American history or European history or British history, but sort of trying to connect the things of what was China doing then and what was happening in Iran then, so we get the overall picture. We've tended to be weak on that score. And so that's a new development. But again, if you look at traditional French historians or British historians and so on, this would just be your sort of bread and butter. Yep.
Do you think the different historiographical traditions have had an effect on how we understand the tension between Christianity and Islam? And further, what is your historiographical style/method to understanding this history and presenting it?
I'm not sure I heard you all the way, but it was the different historiographies affect the relation of these two, and what is my historiography. So the first one, yes, certainly. The world is just seen very, very differently through those. And this is a problem, not just here, throughout the world. English and French Canada have never been able to come to agreement on a common textbook on Canadian history, because they see it differently. Obviously, it's French and English, but I mean, even in translation, the way the story is told, they can't agree on that. So when you're dealing with sort of world historical developments, obviously it's there. In terms of my own historiography, this level, it needn't be that sophisticated. I just want to emphasize, take religion seriously. And this came up in the class for those who were there. There's a tendency, less amongst historians, but political practitioners, people in the State Department, at least in America, not to take religion seriously as a shaping factor in human events. It's always treated as a secondary and epiphenomena. It says we need to get below it and see the real factors which are shaping the world. So I would just say get away from that and take seriously. Obviously, many things which claim to be religious, it's just a cover for something else. But our tendency is more to sort of put religion aside when we shouldn't. Yep.
I know that there are different interpretive methods or hermeneutics according to whether or not Islam is in power. Can you talk about how the different readings of the Quran, when that difference in method was developed, and what the thinking was?
Okay. In terms of the Quran, you have, it's a very difficult book. But in general, it's usually divided into the phase in Mecca and phase in Medina. And so you have the case that the early Meccan phases, Muhammad is a teacher. Things are peaceful, getting on when there was persecution of Muslims. Many fled to Ethiopia where the Christian king protected them. So you have the sort of Meccan phase, a sort of gentler phase of the Quran, if I can put it this way. Then you have the phase in Medina after Muhammad has fled from Mecca and then is at war with Medina and with others. And so these are much more warlike texts. And one interpretive mechanism for many Muslims, it's been the sort of standard view in most settings, is the later texts so reinterpret the former in the way that Christians might take the New Testament. If you're reading the Old Testament, you say, well, New Testament reshapes this idea. So the idea is that the Medina texts, the more aggressive ones, if you can put it that way, are taken to be more authoritative and displace the Meccan texts. And so many people, when they want to emphasize peaceable sides of Islam, emphasize Meccan texts, while not pointing out that for many Muslims, those have now been sort of displaced. They have been abrogated by the later ones. But the question is, abrogation itself is not taught in the Quran, nor in the Hadith, the collected sort of sayings of Muhammad, which are much bigger than the Quran and supply much of the guidance for conduct. Why should one believe in abrogation? So many Muslims who are seeking to rework this emphasize that the Meccan texts are more universal. They're at peace. They are general teaching. Whereas Medina stuff is more immediate things, advice and instructions given in battle. So don't have that same universal quality. So there's that attempt to reinterpret it. There's also the question of the Hadith, the collected statements attributed. For Muslims, the Quran is sort of dictated directly from God. It's very much God's word. It's what God says, not what Muhammad says. But then Muhammad also says many things, so those are collected in multi-volume sources. And they provide for Islamic law, and Sharia, and for many Muslims, that's where your guidance comes from. Yeah. So, and the question is, to what degree should one regard, firstly, those hadith as authentic, because they were often compiled sometimes centuries after the Prophet's death. Muslim scholars tried very much to authenticate them. There's a whole science and method of trying to link these texts back to see if it really was genuine. So the train of transmission is followed. In a court case, we have the sort of chain of custody of the evidence. You need to know who got it from whom and when. But others ask, are they truly authentic? And necessarily, how much should they be binding or reinterpreted? So Indonesian Muslims with whom I work in a lot say, these should be radically contextualized as dealing with 12th and 13th century things. And a lot of them don't mean very much now. The world is not divided into the world of Islam and the world of war. It says, in Indonesia, we're all mixed up. We've got Christians, we've got Muslims, we've got everything. And so that division simply doesn't exist. So those criteria are not helpful.
This is not the end of the conversation, but I figured we could also have conversation all evening. But I do want to take some time and thank Dr. Marshall for coming.
Sure.